Imagine living a life so legendary people write books about you. You win wars, build empires, or dance your way into history. But when death comes, it's not heroic, it's humiliating. A tortoise to the head, a scarf caught in a wheel, or worse, drowned in your own toilet. These aren't myths, they happened. This is the Most Disturbing Deaths Iceberg. Tier 1. Humberto Hernández. You know those random Final Destination moments that don't seem real? Yeah, this one is exactly like that. Except it was real. Humberto Hernández was a 24-year-old construction worker living in Oakland, California, who had moved from Mexico to build a better life. On June 29, 2007, he was walking with his wife on 98th Avenue, carrying flowers and a bag of cherries for their dinner together. It was supposed to be a really good night, but the universe decided to throw 200 pounds of iron at his head, literally. A woman driving a Ford Escape down the street ran over a nail. Her front tire blew out, and the SUV veered into a curb and slammed into a fire hydrant. This was not one of the lightweight aluminum hydrants you see today. It was a cast iron model from the 1960s, bolted deep into the pavement. When the bolts pulled off, the pressure from the water below it launched the entire hydrant into the air like a torpedo. It rocketed nearly 20 feet through the air, moving at roughly 40 feet per second. Before anyone could react, it struck Humberto in the back of the head. He died instantly, and the hydrant kept going, tearing through a fence and landing in a nearby parking lot. His wife, walking just a few steps behind him, was still holding the bag of groceries when she saw him fall. Police said the hydrant struck with enough force to crush a human skull on impact. Police ruled it a freak accident, since there was no speeding and no drunk driving, just a nail and bad luck. The driver was cited but not charged. Humberto's friends and neighbors organized fundraisers to help his wife with funeral expenses. In response, Oakland and other cities began replacing older hydrants with breakaway designs that detach on impact instead of becoming high-velocity projectiles. Every few years, the story resurfaces online as a grim reminder of how unpredictable reality can be. Aeschylus. So imagine this. You're one of the greats, not just any playwright, the playwright. Athens can't stop handing you awards. Plays are so legendary that they'll shape Western drama for thousands of years. And somewhere between the applause and the wine, you still found time to fight at Marathon when Persia came knocking in 490 BC. You've outlived wars, and you've made kings cry in theaters. Your end comes from a bird and a tortoise. Yeah, that's Aeschylus. According to ancient sources, the man was living in Sicily sometime around 455 BC. An oracle had warned him he'd die from a blow that falls from the sky. So Aeschylus, thinking he'd cracked the code, decided to stay outside. No roofs, no walls, no problem. Except, the sky itself is outdoors. He went outside, sat in a sunny field, and minded his own business. Overhead, a massive eagle, specifically a lammergeier, was flying with a tortoise in its claws. Lammergeiers are known for breaking shells by dropping their prey onto rocks. Normally, that wouldn't be a problem, but Aeschylus had a shiny bald head that, from the sky, looked a little too much like a rock. The bird spotted what it thought was the perfect drop zone, swooped over, and let the tortoise go. Valerius Maximus, a Roman writer from the 1st century, claimed the tortoise came down right on Aeschylus's head. The shell shattered, his skull followed, and that was it. Modern scholars don't really buy this story. They think it's probably fiction, an ancient meme, if you will. Still, the legend stuck around for 2,000 years, and honestly, it's hard not to appreciate the irony. Isadora Duncan. If tragedy gave out loyalty cards, Isadora Duncan would have hit platinum status. In 1927, she was a famous dancer. Duncan had spent her life breaking every rule in classical ballet, including choosing to dance barefoot in loose tunics instead of stiff corsets and pointed shoes. She ran dance schools across Europe and Russia, pushed feminist and communist ideas, and burned through lovers, scandals, and money. But behind the fame, her life was a non-stop car crash. Literally. In 1913, her 2 young children drowned when their car rolled into the River Seine. In the years after, she got into multiple car accidents herself, one bad enough to knock her unconscious. Somewhere along the line, between money issues, negative headlines, and a public that had grown sick of her politics and odd behavior, her career began to collapse, leaving behind a woman who'd seen every kind of disaster except the one that was coming next. On the evening of September 14, 1927, in Nice, France, Duncan went out with her friend Mary Desty and a young mechanic named Benoit Falchetto. Desti told Duncan to wear a cape, but she chose a long red silk scarf instead. It was a great fashion choice, but the problem was that it was trailing behind her like a flag. Benoit had plans to show Desti a car, but Duncan, ever impulsive, insisted on taking the first ride. Before getting in, she turned to her friends and said, "Adieu, mes amis, je vais à la gloire." In English, that means, "Farewell, my friends, I go to glory." It sounded dramatic at the time, but unfortunately, it became the most chillingly literal thing she ever said. With a smile still on her face, she settled into the passenger seat, and the car began to roll forward. The scarf caught in the open rear wheel, wound around the axle, and yanked her straight out of the seat. The force snapped her neck instantly. By the time the driver stopped, she was already dead, strangled and nearly decapitated by the same scarf she had worn at nearly every performance. In later decades, doctors and safety experts started using the phrase Isadora Duncan syndrome to describe accidental strangulations from scarves or clothing caught in moving vehicles or machinery. Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe was one of the smartest people of his time, a nobleman, an astronomer, and a guy who built an observatory so expensive it cost Denmark a portion of its GDP. He literally changed how we understand the sky. And yet, he died from what was essentially a solo "don't pee yet" challenge. It happened in October 1601, at a banquet in Prague hosted by Baron Peter Vogt von Rosenberg. Tycho was sitting beside nobles and his assistant, Johannes Kepler. The drinks kept coming, and Tycho, being polite, followed strict court etiquette that dictated that no one could leave the table until the higher-ranking guests did. So when nature started calling, he ignored it for hours. When he got home, the pain kicked in. He couldn't urinate, even though his bladder was ready to call it quits. Every attempt came out in small, bloody amounts. For the next 5 days, he suffered through constant pain, fever, and pressure in his lower abdomen. Eventually, his body started shutting down from urinary blockage. The trapped urine caused toxins to build up in his bloodstream, basically poisoning him from the inside. The condition's called uremia. After about 11 days of agony, Tycho died on October 24, 1601, at 54 years old. Doctors at the time said his bladder burst, but modern medicine thinks otherwise. It's more likely he suffered from acute urinary retention caused by an enlarged prostate or infection, which then led to uremia. Of course, because it was Europe in the 1600s, people could not just leave the story as it was. They had to add drama to level up the show. They started rumors that he'd been poisoned, maybe by his assistant, Johannes Kepler, who inherited his astronomical data, or even by Danish royals over political beef. When scientists exhumed him in 1901, and again in 2010, they found only small amounts of mercury, the kind you'd expect from the medical treatments he is said to have tried, but certainly not enough to suggest he was poisoned. If there's a lesson here, it's that saying "excuse me," even though it breaks the rules, beats dying to save face. Speaking of which, Tycho wasn't the last man to lose a fight with his own insides. There's another guy who went through something similar, only his story ends with an explosion. We'll get to that in Tier 3. Chrysippus of Soli. This guy preached that emotions are dangerous, and self-control is everything, only to die laughing at his own joke. No, seriously, that's what happened. So here's how it went down. It was Athens, around 206 BC. Chrysippus was already an old man, and one of the founders of Stoicism. He had spent decades teaching how to achieve apatheia, a calm state of mind that's free from emotions, such as fear, lust, or excessive joy. Then, one afternoon, he saw a donkey eating his figs. Instead of stopping it, he turned to his servant and said, "Give the donkey some wine to wash them down." After saying those words, he burst out laughing. He laughed, and then laughed some more. Ancient writers like Diogenes Laertius record that he laughed so hard he started choking, collapsed, and died. There are a few versions of the story. Some say he was already drunk and died 5 days later from drinking too much. Others say the laughter killed him instantly. Either way, his death became one of the strangest in philosophy. Modern scholars think the story might be fake, especially when you consider the fact that ancient biographers often made up funny deaths to mock philosophers. It was their version of memes. His rivals probably spread the story to make Stoicism look hypocritical. Tier 2. Sigurd the Mighty. As far as modern medicine goes, there's a lot to be grateful for. But what happened to this guy will make you especially grateful for antibiotics. He was a warlord in the late 800s who conquered half of Scotland, burned villages, built forts, ruled islands, and terrified everyone who can pronounce the word fjord. He was none other than Sigurd Eysteinsson, better known as Sigurd the Mighty. But when death finally came for him, it wasn't from a blade, an arrow, or a god. It was from a tooth. Around 892 AD, Sigurd challenged a local Scottish chief named Maelbrigti the Bucktooth to a 40-man battle. But Sigurd, being, well, the Mighty, showed up with 80 men instead. Sigurd won easily, had Maelbrigti beheaded, and decided to gloat by tying the severed heads to his horse's saddle. You know, for decoration, and because that's what alpha males used to do back then. It sounds like it should be the end of the tale, but it's not. According to the Orkneyinga saga, a 13th century Icelandic chronicle about the Earls of Orkney, fate decided to make a joke out of Sigurd that day. As he rode home, one of Maelbrigti's massive teeth grazed his leg, leaving a tiny cut. The cut was tiny, so it wasn't a big deal, right? Wrong. This was the 9th century, which means there was no antiseptic, no penicillin, and definitely no hand sanitizer. The teeth injected every bacterium that man had been fermenting in his gums straight into Sigurd's bloodstream, and let's just say it was a lot. In modern times, Sigurd developed septicemia, or blood poisoning. Back then, that meant a slow-motion death sentence. The wound would have swollen fast and become dark, throbbing, and hot to the touch. Then came the fever, hallucinations, shivers, and a burning sensation under the skin like fire in the veins. He might have tried to keep riding or drinking through it, but no Viking toughness can outmuscle bacteria. Historians still argue if it really happened or if it's just an old cautionary tale. Don't double your troops or karma will double back. Either way, the irony's perfect. You kill a man and his tooth evens the score. Attila the Hun. Attila the Hun spent 2 decades terrifying half the known world. He burned cities, humiliated emperors, and made Rome itself pay him just to stay away. His army was so feared that people called him the Scourge of God. But when death finally caught up with him, it didn't come from a sword, an arrow, or an assassin. It came from his own nose. In the spring of 453 AD, Attila celebrated his 6th marriage to a young Germanic bride named Ildiko. The wedding feast was massive, filled with drinking, meat, and songs about his victories. Attila, who usually went easy on the alcohol, decided to go all in that night. By morning, his guards found him dead, lying beside Ildiko, his face and sheets soaked in blood. There were no wounds and signs of struggle. According to Priscus, a historian who actually visited Attila's court, the warlord fell asleep on his back after all the drinking. Sometime during the night, he suffered a massive nosebleed, or more likely, a burst blood vessel in his throat. Because he was too drunk to react, he choked on his own blood as it flooded his lungs and airway. By morning, he'd logged out from the server. Modern medical analysis points to chronic liver disease or hypertension from years of alcohol use and stress. His lifestyle of constant feasting, drinking, and warfare could have caused ruptured veins in his esophagus, which caused a simple bleed to become an internal waterfall. His guards cut their faces in mourning, mixing their blood with his before sealing him in a triple coffin, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron. Each layer was said to hold treasure and weapons, then buried in secret beneath a riverbed. To protect the secrecy of his resting place, everyone who took part in the burial was executed afterward. By the way, there was another famous guy who died from drinking a little too much. Only this time, it wasn't alcohol. We'll talk about him in Tier 3. David Grundman. Some deaths are tragic. Others are dumb ways to die. This one manages to be both. On February 4, 1982, a man in Arizona decided it'd be fun to use the desert as his shooting range. He picked a target that couldn't possibly fight back, or at least that's what he thought. Grundman was a 27-year-old ex-con from New York who'd moved to Phoenix after doing time for armed robbery. He and his roommate, James Ouchi, drove out to Lake Pleasant one afternoon with beers, rifle, and a shotgun. Their plan was cactus plugging, which, if you didn't know, means using living 100-year-old saguaro cacti as target practice. Those things are giant desert monuments. Some grow over 25 feet tall and weigh several tons. Shooting them is also illegal, but Grundman and his buddy didn't care. They started small, slowly, and they managed to take down a 10-foot cactus. Feeling confident, Grundman turned his gun on a massive 26-foot saguaro nearby, which is estimated to be over a century old and weighing nearly 4,000 pounds. He walked right up to it, aimed, and fired 2 shots into one of its huge arms. Physics handled the rest. The 500-pound limb snapped off, fell from about 16 feet up, and came down straight at him. The impact crushed his skull and chest instantly, pinning him under a pile of wood, water, and thorns. Medical examiners later said it was like being hit by a car going at 30 miles per hour. Grundman never stood a chance. His friend ran to get help, but by the time deputies arrived, it was too late. The cactus was still standing, minus one arm, and Grundman was dead beneath it. Timothy Treadwell. Timothy Treadwell was a failed actor who turned his obsession with bears into a personal religion. He spent months each year in Katmai National Park, living among grizzlies with no gun, no bear spray, and no fear. He even filmed them up close and named them things like Mr. Chocolate and Booble. He believed they understood him and that they had built some kind of relationship. Rangers, on the other hand, saw a walking time bomb. By October 2003, his luck finally ran out. The salmon run had ended, which meant the bear's main food source was gone for the season. In Katmai, that time of the year turns tense and dangerous, as hungry grizzlies start competing for whatever scraps of food remain before winter. Treadwell had already overstayed his welcome. He and his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, had pitched their tent near Kaflia Lake, right on a bear trail. One night, according to the audio recovered from their camera, they heard something moving outside. What came next was 6 straight minutes of horror. The attack started outside the tent. A recording device accidentally caught it all. Treadwell shouting, "Come out here, I'm being killed out here." Amy unzipped the tent and yelled, "Play dead." It worked for a moment, but the bear came back. You can hear her screaming, "Fight back." Then the sound of a struggle, dragging, and finally, just rain hitting the tent. 6 minutes later, the bear turned on Amy. The tape ended with her screaming alone. When rescuers arrived the next day, they found a 1,000-pound male bear guarding what was left of the campsite. It charged at them and was shot dead. Inside its stomach, they found pieces of both victims, like scraps of clothing, and a watch still ticking. Another bear had been feeding on their remains nearby. The whole thing is a sad reminder that loving the wild doesn't make it love you back. Tier 3. Eben Byers. This man drank over 1,000 bottles of this drink, and his jaw literally fell off. His bones started glowing. His face was decaying, and by the end, his coffin had to be made of lead. Eben McBurney Byers was a millionaire in the 1920s, a Yale graduate, golf champion, and horse racer. He had the kind of money and ego that made him trust anything promising health and vitality. That trust eventually killed him. In 1927, he injured his arm falling off a train. His doctor recommended Radithor, a miracle drink made by a fake Harvard doctor named William J.A. Bailey to help him recover. It was basically distilled water with radium inside. Yep, radioactive poison in a bottle. At first, Byers said he felt amazing, stronger, healthier, more alive. That's what happens when your bones are literally buzzing with alpha particles, but he didn't know that, so he drank more. 2 bottles a day, then 3. Over 3 years, he consumed around 1,400 bottles. Then, the glow-up became literal. Unfortunately, radiation didn't turn him into the Hulk or any superhero. By 1930, his jaw started aching and his teeth fell out. Doctors said it was normal wear. Yeah, sure, normal, if your skeleton is melting from the inside. Soon, his jawbone dropped. Literally, holes formed in his skull, and pieces of his face began to crumble away. Surgeons tried removing the rotting bone, but it kept collapsing. The radium had fused with his calcium, turning his skeleton into a slow radioactive decay. When he died in 1932, 5 years after he first began drinking Radithor, he was 51 and still radioactive. His case became national news. The government finally banned Radithor, and a scam doctor fled the country. Years later, scientists exhumed Byers' body, and it is still hot with radiation. Qin Shi Huang. This man tried to hack immortality and ended up speedrunning his own death. He was China's first emperor, the ruler who united the warring states, built the first version of the Great Wall, standardized writing, currency, and even axle widths. Still, all that power couldn't negotiate him extra time. His entire existence was basically a drama series. His mother, Lady Zhao, was once a merchant's concubine before she partnered up with the king of Qin. And some historians think the story of his birth might have been some grand power-grabbing scheme. His childhood was a political war zone. By age 13, he was already running a state. By his late 30s, he'd conquered every rival kingdom and named himself Shi Huangdi, meaning the first emperor. But then the power trip turned into a death trip. Around 219 BC, Qin Shi Huang got obsessed with immortality. He sent thousands of people to hunt down some mystical elixir on islands guarded by immortal fish. They never came back, probably because the sailors realized that going up against magic fish across an endless ocean could turn out to be a one-way trip. When fantasy island expeditions didn't work out, the emperor turned to alchemists. They told him immortality could be brewed in a cauldron out of mercury. You know, the same metal used inside thermometers and known to cause fatal poisoning in humans. He believed it completely and started downing the stuff like breakfast smoothies, certain it was his ticket to immortality. What he got instead was paranoia, erratic behavior, and a glow that would make a firefly jealous. By 210, during yet another victory tour, the immortal emperor suddenly just dropped dead at 49 years old. His servants panicked, stuffed his corpse in the carriage, and hid the smell with salted fish so no one would notice, and continued the journey to the capital. When they finally arrived, court officials quietly arranged his burial to avoid triggering political chaos. Centuries later, scientists analyzing the soil around his sealed tomb found mercury levels more than 100 times higher than normal, confirming ancient accounts that described rivers of mercury inside his underground palace. Historical texts say the mausoleum was designed to mimic his empire, complete with flowing mercury rivers, mechanical crossbows, and the famous terracotta army standing guard for eternity. Arius. Imagine spending your entire life taking on the church, surviving councils, emperors, and even excommunication, only to be taken out by your own stomach. That's the tragedy of Arius, one of Christianity's most controversial theologians. Arius was tall, thin, soft-spoken, and apparently way too good at arguing. He studied under Lucian of Antioch, which is like an ancient theology grad school, and ended up a respected priest in Alexandria. But then he dropped the hottest theological take of the 4th century. He said Jesus wasn't eternal, but created. In modern terms, he said, God made Jesus. Jesus didn't always exist. You can imagine how well that went. The church immediately lost its mind. Bishops excommunicated him. Councils condemned him. And Emperor Constantine had to step in to host the world's first religious brawl, the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. They drafted the Nicene Creed, branded Arius a heretic, ordered his writings be destroyed, and announced that anyone caught trying to keep or circulate his books could face execution. But it wasn't over just yet, because theology in the Roman Empire was a lot like working for the WWE today. You could get exiled one day and reinstated the next. By 336 AD, Emperor Constantine wanted the drama to end. He ordered that Arius be readmitted to the church and allowed to receive communion the following day. Arius, convinced the worst was behind him, hit the streets of Constantinople with his loyal followers to celebrate. Then, nature called. According to ancient historians, Arius suddenly felt sick near the Forum and rushed to a public toilet. What happened next sounds like a deleted scene from Final Destination, Holy Edition. His bowels literally exploded. His intestines, spleen, and liver reportedly gushed out of his body in a torrent of blood. Of course, witnesses called it divine punishment. Church fathers compared him to Judas, and bishops declared it was God himself delivering the final blow. Modern scholars think it was probably poisoning or extreme gastrointestinal failure, not divine vengeance. But in a society that loved a good miracle headline, Arius' death was viral material. Duke Jing of Jin. If you thought we're done with the stomach business, you're wrong, because this case also involves poop and what some might call divine punishment. But this time, it's for a king. His punishment involves a pool of, let's just say, royal waste. Duke Jing was born around 620 BC, and he wasn't just any noble. He held the state of Jin, a political powerhouse that dominated the Central Plains during China's spring and autumn period. He beat his rival kingdom Chu at the Battle of Yanling, hosted peace covenants with 14 states, and secured Jin's place as the boss of the region. By his 40s, he had wealth, power, and a seriously inflated ego to match, which is when fate decided to humble him in the worst way possible. In 581 BC, the Duke fell ill and started seeing demons in his dreams. Literally. One night, he dreamed of a long-haired spirit breaking down his palace doors and demanding revenge. He woke up terrified and summoned a local shaman, who somehow repeated the dream word for word before the Duke even said anything. They told him that he'd die before the new wheat harvest. The Duke didn't like that part. He got mad, kicked them out, and swore he'd prove the prophecy wrong. After his condition worsened, he called a top physician from Qin, who told him his sickness was stuck between the heart and diaphragm, a death zone no medicine could reach. He was cooked, and that's exactly what the physician told him. When summer came, the wheat finally ripened. Duke Jing was determined to prove the shaman was wrong, so he ordered the first cakes made from the harvest brought to him. He hadn't even taken a bite when he suddenly started feeling pain in his stomach. He staggered toward the latrine and fell into the cesspit. He drowned in feces. His court, probably choking back disbelief in the smell, declared the prophecy was fulfilled. He never got to taste the wheat. Historians later turned his death into a Confucian morality take about arrogance, fate, and ignoring spiritual warnings. Mithridates. Here's a classic Persian life lesson. If the king claims an achievement, don't correct him, even if you're the one who did it. This Persian soldier found that out in the slowest and most painful way possible. Let's rewind to 401 BC. The Persian Empire was tearing itself apart in a family feud. King Artaxerxes II was up against his younger brother, Cyrus the Younger, a rich, ambitious prince with a personal army of Greek mercenaries. The two armies met at the Battle of Cunaxa, and in the middle of the chaos, one Persian soldier named Mithridates hurled a javelin that struck Cyrus right in the temple. Clean shot. Killed him instantly. He didn't even know who he just killed. Imagine finding out your lucky throw accidentally changed world history. Artaxerxes took credit for the kill himself, as most kings do, and loaded Mithridates with gifts and gold. Problem was, Mithridates couldn't keep his mouth shut. Months later, after a few too many drinks at a royal banquet, he bragged that he, not the king, had killed Cyrus. Unfortunately, that was the one story Artaxerxes wanted people to believe differently. To the king, Cyrus's death wasn't just a victory. It was divine justice, proof that he ruled by the will of Ahura Mazda. So, hearing his own soldier claim that glory was a personal insult to heaven itself. Artaxerxes was furious and ordered Mithridates to be executed. He had to suffer first, though, and that's why he was sentenced to death by scaphism. The executioners took 2 wooden troughs, laid Mithridates inside one, then placed the other on top, leaving only his head, hands, and feet sticking out. After that, they started spoon-feeding him milk and honey until he couldn't take another bite. They smeared the rest of it all over his exposed skin and left him out under the sun. Flies came first, then wasps, then worms. The sun bakes you alive, the flies swarm, and your own waste becomes an ecosystem. As the days go by, worms, maggots, and rot slowly digest you from the inside out. Ctesias, the Greek court physician, claimed Mithridates lasted 17 days before finally leaving the server. Imagine waking up every morning and realizing you're rotting alive. It's hard to believe, but what happened to Mithridates isn't as bad as it gets. In Tier 6, there's a guy whose skin was literally rotting while doctors kept them alive with machines. Manius Aquillius. Rome loved its heroes, until they became liabilities. Manius Aquillius came from a family that rose to power through money and bloodshed. His father made a name for himself by crushing uprisings in Asia, and the family eventually became so well respected that later generations minted coins claiming divine ancestry from Sol, the Roman sun god, to show just how favored they were. By his 30s, Manius had built his own reputation on the battlefield. He fought alongside Gaius Marius in the Cimbrian War, took part in the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Germanic tribes, and personally executed a rebel slave leader during the Second Servile War in Sicily. The guy was basically Rome's problem solver. He was basking in the attention. Life was good. And then along came the mission that earned him a spot on this list. He was sent to Asia Minor, where a new threat was rising in the east. Mithridates VI Eupator, the poison king of Pontus. Mithridates was known for experimenting with toxins on prisoners, and even dosing himself daily to build immunity against assassination attempts. Needless to say, he wasn't someone you should take for granted. Achilles' mission was simple: stop Mithridates before he devoured Rome's eastern provinces. but arrogance clouded his judgment. He marched in with too few troops, underestimating both the terrain and his opponent. The result of that bad decision was that Mithridates obliterated him. The Roman legions collapsed. Aquillius was captured, and the king decided to make him a symbol of Roman greed. He had Aquillius paraded through the streets of Pergamon, bound and seated backwards on a donkey to humiliate him before the crowd. He was made to shout, "I'm a Roman tax collector," and as he did it, the crowd went wild. To them, this wasn't just a man. It was years of Roman greed and crushing taxes finally getting what they deserved. Finally, Mithridates ordered a pot of molten gold to be poured down his throat. According to ancient sources like Appian, the execution was intended as a symbolic punishment for Roman greed. Modern medical analysis suggests Aquillius would have died almost instantly from massive thermal burns to the throat, lungs, and heart. But yeah, even though this one's super disturbing, at least he died quite quickly. Tier 4. St. Lawrence. It's the year 258 AD in Rome. Christianity is still an underground movement, and one poor deacon named Lawrence is about to become one of the most enduring martyrs of the early church. Lawrence wasn't some random guy. He studied under Pope Sixtus II and helped distribute money to widows and orphans. Then Rome decided charity was illegal, and Sixtus got executed on August 6. 4 days later, Lawrence gets dragged before the city prefect, a senior Roman magistrate responsible for enforcing imperial law and collecting taxes. The prefect demanded that Lawrence hand over all the church's treasures. So what does he do? He shows up with the poor and sick, smiles, and says, "Behold, these are the treasures of the church." The prefect did not find that funny, so Lawrence gets sentenced to die. And this is where history gets weird. Some say he was roasted alive on a giant metal grate. In this version, he looked at his executioner halfway through and said, "Turn me over. I'm done on this side." Yeah, the man made a dad joke while being grilled alive. That line alone made him the patron saint of cooks and comedians. But here's the catch. Historians think the whole grill thing might be medieval fanfiction. Turns out early Roman execution orders were more about beheading, not rotisserie justice. Some scholars even say it all came from a scribal typo. Something about the phrase passus est, he suffered, being misread as assus est, he roasted. Still, the story became legendary. Emperor Constantine, the guy who legalized Christianity in the 4th century, built a basilica over his grave. Medieval manuscripts painted him smiling next to a grate. And 1700 years later, people still light candles to this man. Whether or not he was literally roasted, St. Lawrence definitely cooked Rome with that one-liner. David Phyall. You know how some people protest by threatening to hurt themselves? Well, David Phyall took it to a whole new level. It's 2008 in Bishopstoke, Hampshire, and 50-year-old David Phyall is the last man standing in a condemned block of flats. Everyone else had packed up and left for shiny new homes promised by a £7.8 million redevelopment project. But not David. He turned every offer down. New flat? Nope. Paid movers? Still no. Free advocacy support? Pass. But this wasn't just defiance. David had mental health issues, and he suffered from epilepsy and depression. To him, relocation was not just about losing a building. It was about losing control, identity, and the last piece of independence he still had. So when the council finally decided to bulldoze the whole place, David decided to make a statement that would literally stop people in their tracks. On July 5th, 2008, David executed himself. He rigged a Black & Decker electric chainsaw under his snooker table, taped it up, attached it to a timer, and placed his neck over the blade. The saw activated automatically, completely severing his head. The coroner called it the most bizarre case he'd ever seen, which, coming from a man who deals with death for a living, says a lot. David left no note, but it's safe to say his silent message was pretty clear. Sadly, it didn't have the effect he hoped it would. Despite the tragedy, the redevelopment eventually went ahead. The site was later renamed Phyall Place in his memory, a small gesture acknowledging the man who became its symbol. David Phyall didn't stop the demolition, but he made sure his exit was impossible to forget. John Edward Jones. If hell had a waiting room, it'd look a lot like Nutty Putty Cave. In November 2009, 26-year-old medical student John Edward Jones came home for Thanksgiving and got hit with a wave of nostalgia. Between the turkey and family catch-ups, he thought, hey, why not go caving in the same muddy hole I explored as a kid? John was no rookie. He was 6 feet tall, athletic, smart, and just months away from having another child. When everything was in place, he crawled into the cave with his brother and his friends, trying to find a passage called the Birth Canal. But instead, he went into an uncharted crevice called Ed's Push. And ironically, that's exactly what he did. He slid down a 70-degree shaft only 10 inches wide. 10 inches. He exhaled to squeeze through, dropped deeper, and realized there was no room to turn around. He was now stuck upside down, head first, 400 feet inside the earth. His chest compressed, blood rushed to his head. Every breath was a fight against gravity. His brother tried to pull him out, but only made it worse. When rescuers arrived, it took them hours just to reach him. A paramedic talked with him, sang hymns, kept him calm. He was scared, but hopeful. He said he just wanted to see his wife and daughter again. He also said he could see angels, but gravity doesn't care about faith. After 27 hours, they almost got him free, until a pulley anchor snapped, smacking a rescuer in the face and sending John deeper into the hole. Not too long after, he stopped responding. His heart couldn't handle being upside down that long. After John's passing, the cave was sealed with concrete. John's body is still down there, entombed in the same rock he tried to explore. The entrance is now closed forever, and a memorial plaque marks the spot where rescue turned into a burial. Thomas Cromwell. If you've ever felt like life handed you the worst reward for doing your best, Thomas Cromwell's story might make you feel a little better. His rise was brilliant, his fall brutal, and his ending, well, I'll let you decide what to think of that. Cromwell didn't exactly start life in luxury, but he had brains. He left England young, worked as a merchant, learned Italian and Latin, fought in France, and came back with a ton of experience. He climbed fast. First, he joined Cardinal Wolsey, the king's right-hand man, and handled the dirty paperwork behind church politics. When Wolsey got axed for failing to deliver Henry VIII a divorce, Cromwell didn't fall with him. He pivoted, slid into the king's orbit, and somehow became Henry's right-hand man. Need a divorce? He'll find a loophole. Need money? He'll sell some monasteries. Need enemies gone? He's got something for that. For nearly a decade, Cromwell became Gus Fring of England, cutting costs, seizing church land, and turning Catholic gold into royal profit. But even the best fixer can overfix. In 1540, Cromwell arranged Henry's latest marriage to Anne of Cleves. But when she finally showed up, Henry took one look at Anne and said, nope, the marriage was annulled. The king felt shame, and everyone needed someone to blame. In true office fashion, when the boss hates the project, he blames the manager. The Duke of Norfolk, Bishop Gardiner, and every noble Cromwell had ever outsmarted finally saw their opening. They teamed up, accused him of treason, threw in a dash of heresy for flavor, and had him hauled off to the Tower. On July 28, 1540, London woke up to a double feature. Henry VIII's shiny new wedding to Catherine Howard at Oatlands Palace, and Cromwell's execution on Tower Hill. The same king who once called him the best servant I ever had was now celebrating while the axe got sharpened. Then came the executioner, young, nervous, and, according to witnesses, possibly drunk. Not exactly what you want when precision is key. He swung the axe and missed the clean line. Cromwell's head didn't come off. Not yet. The crowd gasped. Another blow. Then another. The scaffold turned red as the executioner hacked his way through one of the most powerful men in Europe. Chroniclers called it butcherly. One French ambassador said the scene lasted far too long. The English sources tried to soften it, but everyone agreed. It was messy. Henry lost his greatest mind that day, and probably didn't even notice. He was too busy on honeymoon. Tier 5. György Dózsa. You know how in classic fantasy shows, a peasant becomes a hero and sits on the throne? Yeah, this is exactly like that, except the throne was not so comfortable. So meet György Dózsa, born around 1470 in Transylvania. Dude starts out as a Jekylli mercenary. He fights the Ottomans, wins duels, slices off a Turkish champion's arm, and gets rewarded by the king himself with gold, land, and a noble title. Classic peasant-to-legend moment. If the movie ended there, we'd have a happy ending. But no. The church had other plans. In 1514, Pope Leo X wanted a crusade against the Turks, and Hungary's top cardinal went, sure, let's call it a holy war. To make it official, they made Dózsa commander of a crusader army made up of tens of thousands of peasants, monks, and angry villagers. The problem is, when the nobles realized their workers were running off to play holy war, they freaked. Going off to war meant the workers had to abandon the fields during harvest season, and many landowners punished the families of men who joined Dózsa's army. The crusade was abruptly canceled, but the angry peasants decided, well, since we're already armed, how about we revolt? Under Dózsa's leadership, What began as a holy war turned into a full-scale rebellion against the nobility and the church itself. Dózha's army turned the countryside into a barbecue pit, literally. Nobles were crucified, bishops were burned alive, and peasants shouted slogans about equality while setting castles on fire. It was pretty much the 1514 version of Eat the Rich, but with actual eating involved. When the nobles finally crushed the rebellion, they decided to make an example out of Dózha. They made him sit on a red-hot iron throne, crowned him with a heated iron crown, shoved a burning scepter in his hand, and mocked him as king of the peasants. Oh, and they played music while he screamed. According to several chroniclers, including Antonio Bonifini and later Hungarian sources, his surviving followers were then ordered to eat his roasted flesh. The ones who refused were killed instantly, while the ones who obeyed were forgiven. Some accounts even claim his own brother was among them, though this detail is still debated. It took Dózha hours to die. By the end, his charred body was torn apart and displayed across Hungary as a warning. In the aftermath, the Hungarian parliament passed new laws in 1514 that permanently tied peasants to the land, stripping them of the right to move. They also couldn't refuse to work for their lords. In short, his defeat ended any hope of freedom for centuries. Robert-François Damiens. Robert-François Damiens grew up poor in Picardy, one of 9 kids just trying to get by. As an adult, he bounced between odd jobs in Paris, usually getting fired for stealing, drinking too much, or losing his temper. By 1757, his mental state had started to slip. He became obsessed with religion, angry about new taxes, and spent most nights in taverns listening to people rant about King Louis XV. Then, one cold January evening, he decided to send a message. On the evening of January 5, 1757, as the king was about to climb into his carriage at Versailles, Damiens walked up and stabbed him once in the side with a penknife. The blade pierced his coat, grazed his ribs, and cut through the skin. But the wound was shallow, only about 2 centimeters deep. The king survived, but for Damiens, things were about to get very ugly. Guards tackled him on the spot. He told them he hadn't wanted to kill, just warn. Wrong answer. The French state called it lèse majesté divine humaine, which means a crime against both God and the crown, which was one way to say there will be no quick death. Interrogations began that night. Red-hot pincers, crushed legs, the whole medieval classic. Yet Damiens kept insisting he acted alone. By March, the Parliament of Paris had decided to make an example out of him. 2 months after the attack, on March 28, 1757, Damiens was dragged half-naked through Paris. He knelt before Notre Dame, holding a wax torch to repent, then was carted to the Place de Grève, where thousands had paid for window seats to see the horror show that was about to unfold. Step 1. Rip chunks of flesh from his chest, arms, and thighs with glowing pincers. Step 2. Burn his right hand, which he'd used to hold the knife, in a brazier of sulfur. Step 3. Pour boiling oil, molten lead, and resin into the wounds. Witnesses said the air filled with the smell of cooked meat. Then came the main act, quartering. 4 horses were tied to his limbs and pulled in opposite directions. They failed, which just goes to show that joints are tougher than the movies make them look. After an hour of straining, the executioner's team started cutting tendons by hand, hacking until the body finally came apart. The whole ordeal lasted over 6 hours. At around 10:30 p.m., what remained of Damiens was burned to ashes and scattered to the wind. His family was exiled, his home destroyed, and his name was erased from official records. The execution of Robert-François Damiens was the last of its kind in France before the Revolution. Ginggaew Lorsoungnern. Some executions are over in seconds, others drag on for hours. And then there's Ginggaew Lorsoungnern, who went through the process twice. Ginggaew was a housekeeper in Bangkok. She worked for the Sri Jeon-suk-ying family to look after their 6-year-old son. But after she lost her job in 1978, her desperation and anger turned into not-so-good intentions. She planned to kidnap the boy for a ransom of 200,000 baht, and she got help from her friends, lovers, and petty criminals. On October 18, 1978, she showed up at the boy's school just like she used to. The teachers didn't question it. She had picked him up many times before, but this time she didn't take him home. Instead, Ginggaew and her group drove 250 kilometers northeast to a small rented house in Nakhon Ratchasima province. There, they tied and gagged the child. The plan was simple. Call the parents, get the cash, let him go. But the problem was, it was nighttime. The parents followed instructions for a drop near a rural train line, but in the darkness, they couldn't find the marker, so no money was delivered. The kidnappers panicked. They were afraid of being caught and arguing over what to do with the child. In that chaos, one of them grabbed a knife and stabbed the boy several times in the chest and stomach. He was still breathing, so they dug a shallow grave in the woods, laid him inside, and buried him alive. When investigators later found the body, the autopsy showed soil inside his lungs, which meant he hadn't died from the wounds. Instead, he had suffocated in the grave. The kidnappers were caught within weeks. In court, Ginggaew claimed she tried to protect the boy, throwing herself over him. The others said she was lying. The judges didn't care either way. On January 12, 1979, the Bangkok Criminal Court's verdict was death by firing squad. That same afternoon, Ginggaew was taken to Bangkwang Central Prison for execution. Guards tied her to the post. Knees, waist, chest, elbows. A white hood covered her face, her hands folded in prayer. At 5:40 p.m., the executioners stood 7 meters away, raised their HK-33 rifle, and fired a burst of 10 bullets into her back. She fell forward, motionless. Officials untied her and placed the body on a stretcher, ready for the morgue. Then someone saw her chest move. She was still breathing. At first, no one understood how that was possible. The bullets had pierced her left side, but her heart was on the right. Ginggaew had an undiagnosed condition called situs inversus, where all internal organs are mirrored. Every shot had missed her heart completely. Shortly after, she began gasping, trying to sit up, her body drenched in blood. Guards panicked. The warden ordered she be brought back to the post. They tied her again, this time tighter. The executioner reloaded. Then, a second volley of 15 bullets was fired. This time, they struck her heart directly. She died instantly at age 28. The next morning, many newspapers ran stories about the woman who survived execution and needed to be shot a second time. Tier 6. Hisashi Ouchi. There are painful deaths, and then there's Hisashi Ouchi. This man accidentally became a nuclear reactor. On September 30, 1999, on Tokaimura nuclear plant, Ouchi and 2 co-workers decided to skip safety steps to speed things up. Instead of using proper automated equipment, they hand-poured enriched uranyl nitrate into a precipitation tank. It was built to hold 2.3 kilograms of uranium safely. They dumped 16.6 kilograms, which was 7 times the limit. The result was an uncontrolled chain reaction that lasted nearly 20 hours, spewing out radiation strong enough to fry a person from the inside out. Ouchi was standing right above it. He absorbed about 17 sieverts of radiation, roughly 1,700 times what's safe in a year. For context, that's like getting microwaved by a small sun. Within minutes, he felt his skin burning, started vomiting, and collapsed. His white blood cells were obliterated, and his chromosomes shattered. He was flown to Tokyo and treated by top specialists, but there's only so much you can do when your DNA literally becomes soup. His skin began peeling off in sheets. 90% of his body was raw flesh. Doctors pumped him full of painkillers, antibiotics, antifungals, and antivirals. They even tried a stem cell transplant from his sister, but his body rejected it. It was only a matter of time before his organs began failing one by one. By day 64, Ouchi's heart gave out. They resuscitated him for 50 minutes, which only left him brain dead. Still, his body was kept alive with tubes, machines, and wires for 83 days. Every breath came from a ventilator, and every heartbeat was maintained by medication and electrical support. His skin blackened, bled, and oozed. In the end, his body simply dissolved from the inside out. On December 21, 1999, Hisashi Ouchi's body finally shut down for good after nearly 3 months of agony. Junko Furuta. Junko Furuta was born on January 18, 1971, in Misato, Saitama Prefecture. She wasn't part of any shady group, just a diligent high schooler saving up from a factory job, dreaming of becoming an idol. No drugs, no crime, no trouble. The kind of girl your teacher would point to and say, be like her. But on November 25, 1988, her ordinary evening walk home became the start of 44 days of hell. A teenager named Shinji Minato knocked her off her bike, pretending it was an accident. Then came Hiroshi Miyano, a wannabe Yakuza kid, who offered to help. Instead, he pulled a knife, kidnapped her, and dragged her into a nightmare. They brought her to Minato's family home in Adachi, Tokyo. His parents lived there, his brothers too. Nobody stopped it. For the next month and a half, that 10-square-meter room became a dungeon. The 4 main perpetrators and at least 12 other boys took advantage of Junko to at least 500 times. Let that number just hang there for a second. But even that was just the warm-up, the opening act. In the following days, they deprived her of food, burned her skin with cigarettes, and beat her with different objects. She was forced to drink and eat inedible substances and left without medical care even as her injuries worsened. And in case you were wondering, yes, the family living in that same house knew something was terribly wrong. They heard noises, they saw signs, but they were too afraid of the Yakuza-connected boys to report it. They were just too terrified of the Yakuza-connected kids to do a thing. After Junko tried to escape once, the mistreatment became even more brutal. By early January 1989, she was severely injured, malnourished, and unable to stand. Reports say that toward the end, she begged them to delete her. And on January 4th, 1989, when one of them was in a foul mood after losing a mahjong game, they finally did. They tortured her for 2 hours, set her on fire again, and she finally died from traumatic shock. They stuffed her body into a 55-gallon oil drum, filled it with concrete, and dumped it at a construction site in Tokyo's Koto ward. It stayed there until March, when workers accidentally found it. Police traced the crime back to the group after one of the suspects confessed during questioning for an unrelated assault. All 4 were arrested soon after, and charged with kidnapping, confinement, and murder. Because they were all juveniles, the court ruled under Japan's youth law. The longest sentence given was 20 years, handed to ringleader Hiroshi Miyano, who was released in 2009. The others served shorter terms. Junko Furuta's case remains one of Japan's most disturbing examples of how justice can fail victims. She's remembered not just for what was done to her, but for how no one stopped it. Wang Weiqin. If you've ever heard the phrase death by 1,000 cuts, it wasn't a metaphor at first. It was law. And in 1904, a man named Wang Weiqin became one of the last to endure it. He was born around 1870 in Shandong province. Wang wasn't a peasant or a rebel. He was a landowner, wealthy, connected, and feared. He used his power to settle disputes the old-fashioned way, through intimidation and blood. In 1904, a feud over farmland turned into a massacre. Wang hired killers to wipe out 2 rival families, including women and children. The Qing government couldn't ignore something that brutal. He was arrested that August, tried in Beijing, and convicted of mass murder and rebellion against imperial authority. The court sentenced him to lingqi, which means slow slicing. This punishment was reserved for the worst crimes: treason, parricide, or in this case, slaughter that mocked the emperor's peace. On October 31, 1904, at Kaishoku execution ground, thousands gathered to watch. Foreign diplomats rented vantage points. French officers even brought cameras. Wang arrived in a chariot before being stripped to the waist and tied to a wooden frame. Then the knives began. Executioners didn't aim to kill fast. They started small, cutting thin slices of flesh from the chest, thigh, and arms. Maybe a few dozen at first. The body was kept alive with tourniquets and hot irons to cauterize bleeding. Every scream was met with another cut. For nearly an hour, Wang remained conscious, shaking as his skin and muscles were peeled away. Reports described hundreds of cuts, not thousands, but enough to expose bone. When he finally lost consciousness, they severed his head. Afterwards, his remains were burned, and the ashes were scattered to prevent burial. Some reports claim that portions of his body were displayed briefly on city gates before being cremated as a warning to others. That was one of the last legal executions by lingqi in China. Just months later, the Guangzhou emperor abolished the punishment entirely, calling it a relic of a cruel age. But Wang's death had already made its rounds in Europe. His photos were printed in French newspapers, fueling colonial disgust and fascination alike. All the deaths we cover today show just how fragile life can be, and how quickly it can turn from ordinary to nightmarish. Some are tragic, some are shocking, but all of them remind us of the thin line between survival and disaster. Thanks for watching.